Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first webinar in the 2019 MSHA webinar series by Conn Maciel Carey. Today we will be discussing a 2018 in review for MSHA, as well as some of the items to look out for in 2019. As always, I am going to be your presenter today, Nick Scala. I am the chair of the MSHA practice group at Conn Maciel Carey, where we represent mine operators and independent contractors in all forms of involvement in litigation with MSHA, whether by managing on-site inspections, investigations, or handling litigation on contest afterwards. We also work with companies regarding setting up compliant safety and health policies, as well as taking you through the process of defending agent investigations, as well as whistleblower and discrimination investigations. So, you know, we kind of work with the mining industry in all aspects of what has to do with the agency, and this presentation is geared towards giving you all a bit of a head start on what to look for in 2019, as the inspection season is going to be picking up for those operations that maybe have more seasonal running times, and also just some areas that we're seeing trends and peaks and valleys in terms of what is the focus of the agency and where that might be taking us. So as you can see from our agenda today, we're going to go with a brief overview of just some enforcement statistics to start. This is, you know, not always the most exciting part, but it gives us a good idea about the shifting views or priorities of the agency when looking at how they're enforcing different subsects of the industry. Also, we're going to look at a couple initiatives and emphasis programs that have been rolled out in the last calendar and fiscal year for the agency. This is interesting because just the term initiative or emphasis program, that's historically not something that we have seen with MSHA for some time. In the former administration with Joe Main at the helm, you maybe had areas where focus was being pushed, but it wasn't the same as a true initiative or emphasis program that we typically see from OSHA more so. We're also going to take a look at what is new on the rulemaking agenda, and part of that will be the updates to the penalty, civil penalty figures, because now we have that annual inflation update. And then lastly, we're going to round out a brief discussion on what is a rather hot and divisive topic, but the One MSHA initiative, or the reconfiguration of the agency, removing the division between metal, non-metal, and the coal industries. We're also going to take a look at maybe some bullet points on what to look for in 2019, and that can be just the continuance of the norm, or maybe some individual areas where we might see a change in policy. So with that, we will get going and look at the first section of the industry for the 2018 regulations. And you know, luckily, MSHA got these regulations or this information out pretty quickly. There's other elements of and statistics that are helpful, but have not been created yet, and for that, we're still relying on 17 data. And I typically mean there the number of mines in operation, the number of miners, along with the injury rates, fatality rates, inspection hours per mine, and the citation numbers in total. So we don't have that yet for 2018. If we look back quickly at 2017, the total number of mines just decreased slightly from the year before. We still had about 13,100 active mines in the country, and with that, about 320,000 and change miners. When we're going back through, you know, something to keep in mind, 2017, there was a total of 28 mining fatalities. We just scooted in underneath that in 2018. And there was a average inspection hour per mine of 56 hours. Now, some people are probably saying, wow, that's a crazy amount of times for hours for an inspector to be on site. Other people are saying, I wish I could only have an inspector on site for 56 hours a year. So that is obviously a number that swayed a great deal between, or depending upon the size of the operation. But nonetheless, if we're going to go back and look at some of these areas where we continue to get a great deal of citations or enforcement, or we have some new areas poking out, we want to look at these most cited standards for 2018. So as I mentioned before, on the screen right now is the sand and gravel operations. So a fairly large composition of the metal non-metal mines out there. And we can see that there was around 15,000 citations for this area or for this type of operation. To give some context, in 2017, there was roughly 58,000 citations issued in the metal non-metal industry in total. So this for 2018 is roughly 16,000 citations issued, and probably unsurprisingly, the citation that we continue to see, if as the top issued or if not the top, one of the top, is 56-14-107A. And as you all know, that is a guarding citation. So even though guarding has been probably the most cited standard, or one of, over the last decade, it continues to get a fair amount of attention. Coming in right below that, we have an electrical standard, and this is for electrical conductors. It's most commonly issued, 56-12-004, for damage to electrical cords, whether that's with a plug or there's a cut in the outer insulation. So that is a citation that is pretty common as well. It's pretty low-hanging fruit. If you do have a damaged cord on site, just make sure it is either repaired or discarded, because that is one that, even if it's not in use, MSHA can come out and issue the citation, and it is many times, especially if it's in use, going to be issued as an SMS. The next one is just a record keeping for reporting your quarterly hours. Just remember that they're due at the same point in time, and if you do not get them in time, your next inspection, you're probably going to get a citation under 50.30A. A couple other ones that are interesting of note, 56-14-132. This is for horns, specifically 14-132A. So make sure that horns are working and on other audible devices on your mobile equipment. 56-14-100B is what we have for the metal non-metal industry in terms of a catch-all, right? This is our defects affecting safety. It can be issued for a lot of different instances, and it commonly is. But I'm actually surprised that this number isn't higher. It is less than half of what was issued for the standard on guarding, and that is surprising to me. But nonetheless, it's still up there, along with, rounding out the bottom, safe access at 52-11-001. And then just above that, the number 8 one coming in is another guarding standard, and that's 56-14-112B. Now, it's important to note the distinction between 14-107, which is not having a guard in place or having a hole in a guard, and 14-112B, because that is having to do with the construction of the guard. So your guard was not constructed to withstand the shock and vibration of continuous operation. Two different standards that may be cited when there is a guard missing. When we see 56-14-112B, that's typically an instance where the guard is there, but it might have fallen off or been knocked off. Those are two different situations where guarding can come into play, and they're both in the top 10. So even though the big push on guarding and all the PowerPoints are years in the past, they continue to be an area of emphasis and focus for the agency. Next, we have the surface stone operations, again, about roughly 15,000 citations. Here we see a more even distribution. You don't have although the guarding citation, 14-107A, is the top citation issued, you don't have it as great of a disparity between that and the number 2 issue and down. As we just mentioned, you can still see a lot of the same citations. You have the extension cords and the damage to electrical conductors again. You have defects affecting safety and horns. You also have here some new additions in terms of 56-20003. That is housekeeping. So material spillage, having areas that might be slick. That is an area that continues to be a focus for the agency, as well as 56.14.100C. And now this is not a defect affecting safety. It is for failure to remove a piece of equipment when a defect is identified or a defect exists. So, you not only have to identify and correct any defect, but if a defect is present on a piece of equipment, it's got to be removed because that is a separate citation under the standards. Keeping going, surface metal operations, we can see mostly of the same standards again. We see a few different standards, a bit more in the electrical realm, and that being those standards that start with 56.12 or 12, and then a continuation of the numbers. So 56.12.018 is the identification of power switches. That is one that we commonly see. We also have 56.12.028, which is continuity testing and resistance testing, as well as 56.12.032. These are cover plates on circuits. So a good bit in this industry regarding the electrical standards. When we are looking back at our history, at our own operations history, and we see a lot of standards coming down that are electrical, that gives us a good idea about where our focus is going to be on an upcoming inspection. There's been instances in the past where when you get a high number of citations under the electrical subsection, that you get an inspector that has some expertise or prior work experience in that field, and that can, almost turn into a spot inspection on that system or those systems in some cases, and can sometimes be pretty problematic, especially when they come out there with instructions to specifically look at an area. So we want to continuously review our inspection history. This is one of the top things we can do in preparing for future MSHA inspections. And when we do, we want to identify kind of if there are those subsections where we have a higher number of citations than others. Obviously, we want to look at if there are also going to be a higher number of SNS citations under certain subsections, but typically one that people get snuck up on because they might be non-SNS, they might be pretty quick fixes, is the electrical standards, because it might just be placing a label on a circuit, or replacing a knockout or a plug-in, or throwing away an extension cord, and we have 50 more locked in the cabinet. But those are areas that build up and they become a trend pretty quickly. So we want to make sure we monitor those. Underground stone, we're going to see a lot of similar standards under Section 57 of 30 CFR. But a shift here, as opposed to the previous operations, which were all surface, is unsurprisingly the most cited standard, and that is 57.3200. And that is going to be ground conditions. So maintaining safe ground control, proper scaling, those are items that are going to be wrapped up into citations under that standard. Otherwise, we see a lot of the same standards, whether it's going to be guarding under 14.107A or 14.112B. Also, we have a lot of the familiar electrical standards, as well as housekeeping and safe access as 57.11.001. Safe access is number 1 on that. We can also see that this is a less prevalent section of the industry. We can see that there's 2,000 citations cited for underground stone operations in 2018. So quite a departure from the 15 or 16,000 we saw with surface stone or surface sand and gravel. Also on this list, rounding out the top 10, is going to be 57.14.207, and that's parking procedures. And I just point that out specifically because that's the citation, even in the surface operations, I saw increase in 2018. A lot of citations for improper parking procedures, namely not setting a parking brake. So this is low-hanging fruit. It's a simple citation. It's something that we should be reviewing with our personnel, but you always have to set a parking brake on a piece of equipment. Even if it is chalked, it needs to have the parking brake set. So just make sure everyone knows that. These are most commonly going to be non-S&S citations, most commonly going to be low negligence. If they're not low negligence, you can get them moved to no low negligence pretty easily through contest. But if a parking brake is not set, the agency is very reluctant to vacate them because it is a standard, and it is a pretty clear standard that the parking brake needs to be set, even if it is going to be chalked or turned into a bank or on level ground. So 56, 57, 14207, that's one that I saw a spike in personally in 2018, where it wasn't previously a very commonly cited citation. At least that came across my desk. If we look at underground non-metal operations, again, still a relatively small amount of total citations issued, about 1,600, a little more. I won't go through all of these. We see a lot of the same citations and standards again. Of note, the bottom one is going to be the annual inspection of fire extinguishers, 57 and 56, 4201 A2. So we know we have to do our monthly checks, we know, and then annually we have to do a check as well. This is, again, a standard that is hard to defeat because if we didn't do the test and we didn't do the inspection, we violated the standard, even if the fire extinguisher is in perfectly operable condition. So we need to remember to keep this list and keep our fire extinguishers up to date. We also want to make sure that we record our inspections whenever they're done, because if we don't have a record, MSHA will take it as the inspection or the review of the equipment did not occur. So we want to make sure that we keep that well documented and we keep it accessible if we don't keep a tag on each individual extinguisher, which most companies do. So otherwise, you see a lot of similar citations that we have been seeing. Next, we have the underground metal operations, slightly higher in citations issued, about 2,500. But again, we see for the majority of them are very similar citations, whether it is, again, fire extinguishers, defects affecting safety, or ground control. The number 4 cited standard, 573360, is for the design, maintenance, and use of ground control or ground support. Ground support in an underground mine. So that is maybe something more unique to these operations, the underground metal mines, where you're going to have more in terms of ground support in place. Also, number 9 is going to be 57.2.0011, and that is the same regulation as it is in Part 56 for surface operations. And this is barricades or signs to identify hazards in areas. And it makes sense in the underground operations. You want to be able to adequately and properly notify people as to what might be on the next rib or what might be down the next shaft. But this is also a standard that I saw increasing use of in the surface operations, specifically for surface operations that may have health areas where there is a dust production or something along those lines. I saw MSHA issuing citations for failing to have signs that there could be a respirable hazard in that area. So kind of a difference of approach to what we previously saw. I think one thing that we will continue to see in 2019 is an increased focus by the agency on health monitoring and on the safety of miners regarding the health and respirable dust standards. MSHA has relatively modest, I think that might be the nicest way to say it, relatively modest regulations on respirable dust, especially compared to the voluminous regulation that OSHA just put out on respirable quartz and silica exposure. But with that said, there still are regulations, there still are requirements for health monitoring, and this is an area that the agency has been putting more focus on in 2017 and 2018, and I think that is just going to increase even further in 2019. This is going to be an area where we see a lot more attention. Rounding out the rest of the enforcement, though, we look at some coal citations. In 2018, there was roughly 4,700 coal citations or citations issued in surface coal operations. Here we have a number of different standards that were cited, but by far the most prevalent was the correction of defective equipment on loading and hauling. So a more specific standard for the coal industry on defects on mobile equipment. We also see that the next one is 77404A, and that's going to be equipment shall be maintained in a safe condition and removed from use if unsafe. It applies to both mobile and stationary equipment. So both of our top two here are going to be having to do with defects on mobile equipment or stationary equipment if we're looking at the second standard. We also are going to have a high amount of citations issued under the accumulation of combustible materials, which is 771104, as well as high walls and ground control, which is down there rounding at the bottom at 771000. So similar themes, albeit different standards now because we're out of the metal non-metal industry, but we can see that defects on equipment still lead the day, as well as concerns regarding ground condition, and in the coal industry, a significant concern is going to be the accumulation of combustible materials. In underground coal, we saw in 2018 almost 40,000 citations issued, so quite a spike in departure from the other areas of the metal non-metal industry. For example, in 2017, there was a total of 46,800 citations issued in the coal industry. So if you look at our 38,000 here and roughly 5,000, we'll call it, in the last section for surface coal, you have similar numbers of citations being issued between 2017 and 2018 in the coal industry, maybe a slight drop-off. But again, we're going to have our most cited standard, 75400, is going to be for the accumulation of combustible materials, mainly coal dust. Our second standard is going to be for ventilation, designed and controlled methane and respirable coal dust. So a bit of different priorities when we're looking at the coal industry than metal non-metal, obviously, which goes without saying. But similar to what we saw in underground metal non-metal, 75202A is going to be protection from roof or rib falls. So again, looking at ground control. And then we have the other standard in the top three, 751403. That's going to be looking at other safeguards specific to certain elements in the coal mining industry. So probably not the most eye-opening review of enforcement statistics and trends, because we're used to seeing those numbers, especially in the metal non-metal industry, where we have defects affecting safety and guarding citations ruling the day, and that continues to be the case. And what we should take from that is this is areas that continue to be looked at by MSHA inspectors, that continue to be issued citations by the inspectors. And at this point, we should be very clear on what's expected from guarding, and we just need to be diligent in our maintenance of those guards. I think probably the reason the standards are mostly 14107 is because that picks up the damaged guards, and guards that might have a hole in it or might have not be sufficient in their size due to damage. That is something that those areas get cited more so than the construction. The construction is typically going to be for guards that have fallen off, or maybe were not securely in place when MSHA observed them. So a bit difference there, but it's an area where we continue to see citations, and we have to be continually diligent. It's also an area where I've seen some citations as of late buckling up, or doubling up, I should say, on the workplace exams. Be wary of these citations. They don't carry a lot of weight, but now that there's been a couple cases out there in conjunction with this new workplace exam regulation that say that there is an inherent adequacy requirement with workplace exams, we see that some inspectors are issuing a citation for failing to do an adequate workplace exam if they observe whatever predetermined number of citations or violations of while on site. So for example, you might get 5 or 6 citations, maybe several of those are what they consider to be apparent guarding citations or housekeeping citations that should have been observed and should have been corrected during the workplace exam process. I've seen them now issuing citations saying that you did not do an adequate workplace exam because these were not discovered and corrected during that process. Again, I think that is a stretch. I think there is a burden on MSHA to prove that the workplace exam was not adequate or was not adequately done. But then when challenging it, you have to be prepared that you're going to get called out on what is your training for a workplace exam. How do you determine a competent person? What is done and what is the process for correction of the hazards? And if there is an area that there was a spillage of material and it looks like it's been there for some time, why is that area not being inspected? It might be because it's not in use, or it is not in the active working area, or maybe it is just infrequently accessed when maintenance is needed. And if that's the case, that needs to be made apparent to the investigator or the CLR or attorney following up if you're contesting it. So just a couple areas where we're seeing maybe those most cited standards can be lumped into or create another violation under the workplace exam rule. I will say that the workplace exam rule, from at least what I've heard, has not been as big of a obstacle or roadblock on continued operations. I think most of the operators had taken sufficient steps to prepare for it becoming a final rule and going into effect last year. And that's good. That is, commendable that people were doing that. Also, I think that the best practices of many operators was to have the workplace exam done prior to beginning work in an area. So just remember, though, that rule is still out there. If there is going to be anything that happens, an incident, an accident, some kind of injury, and an inspector comes out, you are going to have those records reviewed immediately. Probably this is going to happen even during normal EO1 inspections or your regular safety and health inspections, but most definitely if there is any type of incident or injury on site. So, your workplace exam records, we want to make sure that we are up to date and following with that new regulation in terms of what information is recorded. We have the same obligation to maintain the records for 12 months from the date of inspection, but we need to make sure that we are still maintaining them properly, in that we have recorded descriptions of the adverse conditions if they're not immediately corrected, as well as making note of when they're corrected if they are not corrected during that shift. So some things to keep in mind. The next item on the 2018 review is mining fatalities. And I'm not going to go through these one by one because MSHA always does this on their quarterly stakeholder calls if you take place or attend those. If not, I recommend you do. They are interesting and informative. They give you an idea about where the agency is going. But what we do know is that there was 27 total mining fatalities. MSHA is designating these between surface and underground, which comes back to the one MSHA policy that we are going to discuss later on. No longer reporting them as coal and metal non-metal. 2018 is the last year that they're distinguished on the MSHA website. If we look at it now, the normal counter where it said, year to date, metal non-metal fatalities, coal mining fatalities, it now just says mining fatalities. So they are now distinguishing between surface and underground, regardless of what is mined. Of these, 13 were from powered haulage, which is one of the emphasis programs that MSHA has launched, and one that they are going to continue to pursue pretty diligently. For reference, this 27 is the lowest recorded number on record by MSHA for mining fatalities. The lowest is in 2016 when there was 25 mining fatalities on the year. Last year there was 28. So a big decrease even from just in 2014 and 2013 when the mining industry was up in the 40s in terms of annual fatalities. So that is a very good trend that we're seeing. In terms of comparison, for the sake of looking at maybe some other comparisons, because we always hear a lot about the mining fatalities. We see, that our number is about 27 for the year. In OSHA reportable fatalities, and this is coming back from 2017 data because they haven't reported their 2018 data yet, but 2017, under OSHA's jurisdiction, there was over 5,000 workplace fatalities. In the mining, oil, and gas industry, so not obviously our mining, but namely the oil and gas extraction, there was over 100 fatalities. And in the construction industry, which is a related industry of some sorts, depending on what type of construction we're looking at, there was over 900, almost 1,000 fatalities. So there is a lot of talk, and obviously the goal is always to strive for zero, but the mining industry is improving safety, and I think that's something to be proud of for everyone involved. As we talked about, there are some new initiatives. It was going to be, they were announced last year, they were talked about a good bit, and they continue to be, but the first one we want to talk about is powered haulage. This is addressing three different issues in MSHA's mine, and again, this can be because this year, this past year in 2018, they claimed that roughly 48% or 13 of the 27 fatalities were the result of powered haulage, and they say that it was a similar percentage the year before. So this is going to look at mobile equipment at surface mines, seatbelt usage in mobile equipment, as well as conveyor belt safety. And I think that's an important element that might be forgotten when we talk about powered haulage, that this also includes conveyor belts. So if we are going to look at this, we tie it back to those areas that are the most cited, standards that we reviewed earlier, right? 56.14.100B for the metal non-metal industry is going to be defects affecting safety. This is namely on mobile equipment. We also have seatbelt usage is always something that's inspected and looked at. Conveyor belt safety is going to be a lot of guarding, as well as lockout, tagout, but primarily we're looking at guarding that. So we want to keep these areas at the forefront of our training and our safety talks with our miners, because this is an area that inspectors have been told to pay more attention to when they come out on site. What are the defects? Are pre-operational checks being done? Are they being done thoroughly, and are they being recorded properly if a defect is found? Are we reporting these defects to management as needed? These are all elements of the mobile equipment or powered haulage process that we need to make sure that we're following. Likewise, are we doing a good inspection of our conveyor belts? Are we maintaining guards in an appropriate manner? And are we properly locking and tagging them out before maintenance is taking place? So areas where we have a great deal of exposure because the business is dependent upon the transfer of material, whether by conveyor belt or mobile equipment. We have to pay attention to this. This comes out and takes up a great deal of the mining process. What we have also seen is that MSHA has reached out and asked the industry to report back best practices for powered haulage, as well as opened up a request for information on the rulemaking initiatives for looking for new regulations that they could create based on power haulage and making this a safer aspect of the mining industry. So there is actually action taken on the regulatory or rulemaking standpoint that coincide with this emphasis program. This is also an emphasis program that's tied directly to the trends in fatal injuries in the mining industry, similar to what we saw previously under the Joe Main MSHA with rules to live by. Based on some talks with MSHA personnel, the rules to live by program is going to be walked back. There might be a little less emphasis on this by the inspectors in the field, as well as the agency as a whole, and we might see more of these emphasis programs because there is that we're putting a focus on it in that way as opposed to looking at the rules to live by standard. Those aren't going to be withdrawn, we just might not see the program getting as much attention, as much push. But nonetheless, I think these emphasis programs are going to be where that renewed push into trends in the industry regarding injuries or fatal injuries takes place. Similarly, the other initiative that was launched in 2018 was on fire suppression systems. This is again going to be looked at mobile equipment, whether it is manufacturer installed or aftermarket installed on a piece of equipment. This really came out last year after at a coal mine. There was one fatal fire in a mobile equipment, and then in a short time afterwards, a fire that did not result in a fatality, but nonetheless was in the same type of equipment. And these both had fire suppression systems on them, both of which did not work. So MSHA is putting an emphasis program on this. They're going to be having inspectors pay more attention to these systems when they're on site. They've also published a checklist for you to do your own internal inspections on suppression systems, and that is the bottom bullet point on this. That's why it's hyperlinked in a different color. But we must maintain them, and I think that this is an area where we have to look at, is it installed, or is it factory installed, or is it aftermarket? If it is on the equipment, it has to be maintained. It goes back to that. Even if there are other safety features or it was an aftermarket and we don't want to use it anymore, then we need to look at removing it from the system entirely, because if it is on a piece of equipment, it must be maintained in a functional condition. You have to look at the National Fire Protection Association regulations when maintaining these systems, as well as the manufacturer recommendations. The 30 CFR doesn't have a great deal of specifics as to these systems, which is unsurprising given the limited nature and specificity of this system. So MSHA is going to be looking back at other types of materials in terms of finding out the best practices for maintaining these. Also, they highlight that task training is an essential element of these systems, because the operators must be educated enough to help maintain, respond to alarms, or use the system in the event of emergency. So, as has been a trend for a number of years, we see MSHA tying back in their emphasis programs or their initiatives to task training, because that is an essential element of the process to be able to safely operate the equipment. So we see that MSHA continues that trend in their new initiatives. On the rulemaking side, there hasn't been a great deal of movement or push forward. There hasn't been a great deal of substantive new rules that have been pushed out. In the pre-rule stage, we have the exposure of underground miners to diesel exhaust. This rule or pre-rule has been around for quite a while, and the comment period has been reopened again until late March 2019. After the Trump administration took over, some of the first rulemaking that we saw come out that was new, it wasn't existing, was the regulatory reform of existing standards and regulations. This is simply polling and a request for information on what regulations can we change, what regulations are obsolete, what regulations can we maybe combine with others due to advances in technology. It's part of the streamlining of the regulatory body and the bureaucracy that the current administration has championed since they got into office. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement in there. MSHA just continues to collect information and has been for some time. This is similar to the alternatives to petitions for modification pre-rule item. The petitions for modification is a rather cumbersome process in which you must apply through MSHA to have essentially be granted an exemption from a standard because you have either developed a new technology, a new method that may not coincide or comply with the letter of the regulation, yet it's further safety and health beyond the existing regulation. When we do this, when we have to apply for this through the agency, then it goes before an administrative law judge before we get to the point where it is granted. Also, they are typically mine specific. So they're looking for alternatives. How can we streamline this process and make it a more viable process for companies to pursue? It is similar to the regulatory reform pre-rule item. So again, how can we streamline the regulatory system? The retrospective study of respirable coal mine dust, this was written into the final 2014 rule that there would be a retrospective study that took place 4 years after. So it began in 2018. Initially, when the coal mine rule or this retrospective study was put on the regulatory agenda, it did not have the name it has now. It had a much more alarming name to many who maybe didn't know that it was a study written into the final rule, and it was looked at as MSHA trying to appeal the respirable coal dust rule. That is not what's going on. It was written into the final rule that a study had to be done 4 years after that final rule went into place. It has a comment period that ends in July. Excuse me. In terms of the safety improvement technologies, this is the powered haulage rule, and it is a request for information, or at least it was, that ended just at the end of 2018 on December 24th. And that was seeking information regarding best practices and new ideas for regulations that can further reduce the hazards associated with powered haulage. So it's what we talked about previously. But that is officially listed as a pre-rule item on the regulatory agenda for MSHA. There's only one item listed as a final rule stage item on the regulatory agenda for MSHA, and that is the Refuge Alternatives for underground coal mines. This was a rule that went final. A specific element was challenged before the DC Circuit. The rule was remanded for MSHA to seek additional comments on the training element, and the specific element is whether or not the training should be done quarterly or annually. So they are waiting. That period has ended. They're awaiting a final publishing of the rule in the Federal Register to see where the agency goes with that. As with all of these, that rule may be, again, reopened for comment. We'll just have to wait and see. Probably the most tangible rule that will affect us on a day-to-day basis is the Civil Penalty Inflation Adjustment Act, and that was passed back in 2016. And it didn't affect MSHA penalties as much as it affected OSHA penalties, which had not been increased in a great deal of time. And in that case, some OSHA penalties increased by almost 80% overnight. The MSHA regulations, they had updated their penalty structure more frequently back in 2006 and 2007. And the Inflation Adjustment Act now updates them each January 15th. That was a bit delayed this year due to the government shutdown, but nonetheless it was published in the Federal Register on January 23rd, and we have a new penalty structure. So, this breaks it down. This is one of the Department of Labor's charts. It's probably one of the easier ways to break down the changes. We can see on the right-hand side the 2018 and 2019 penalty figures, whether it was the minimum or the maximum. So a relatively modest increase in the minimum penalty for a regular citation from 132 in 2018 to 135, not including the 10% good faith reduction that you typically get with a citation. The maximum statutory penalty for a non-flagrant violation increased about $2,000 up to $72,600 from about $70,800. We also see an increase in the minimum for a 104D1 citation or order up to $2,421, and a 104D2 citation up to $4,800. The other items of note are the one for failing to provide timely notification. So your minimum penalty if you fail to notify MSHA within your 15-minute obligation in the event of an accident, and this is again their predetermined 12 accidents or and in death at a mine, regardless of if we think it is mine-related at that point in time, we still have to call, as well as an injury that has a reasonable potential to cause death. And then the accident items are that list of an inundation, an unplanned explosion, a roof fall. There's an entire list of them if you look at Part 50. That is a minimum penalty of $6,000 and a bit more if you do not notify MSHA within that 15 minutes. That penalty can go all the way up to $72,000, that's statutory max, but typically we see them on the lower end, and that's $6,052 is where that is. A 104B order, while they are rarely assessed a penalty in my experience, that continues to increase, and they can be up to $7,800 per day that you are in violation of a 104B order, meaning a citation was issued that was not abated in a timely manner. Now again, we typically can avoid those by taking some sort of action to show that we had taken steps to abate it, whether by preventing access to what was cited or by ordering the materials to correct it and preventing access. But nonetheless, a 104B does carry or have the ability to carry a penalty, although it typically does not. One of the only standards that can be, or that a individual miner can be issued a citation under is the smoking standards under 100.5D, and that increases to 332, and the flagrant violations increases to 266,000 from 259. So the majority of those probably don't affect us that much, but the minimum penalty will increase slightly from what it has been the last year. Again, though, this will increase again next year and the year after that. Every January 15th is when those come into play. So rounding out, the One MSHA initiative is something that we may have heard and maybe wasn't called that when we heard it, but we know the aspect of it that comes into play. There is a reconfiguration going on, and it is a priority of the Assistant Secretary right now to merge metal, non-metal, and the coal divisions. These have been distinct administrations of MSHA since the agency was created for the most part, and they have maintained that until this year. So we have just had Timothy Watkins named as our administrator for coal and metal, non-metal, safety, and health. The gentleman who has held the title acting direct administrator of metal, non-metal, and was prior to that administrator for coal, Kevin Strickland, is now with the Office of Education Policy and Development, where he is the director, and Tim Watkins, who was with the coal, mine safety, and health division previously and was a district manager at a coal district in West Virginia, is now going to be in charge of coal and metal, non-metal, safety, and health. So a bit of a distinction. What does this mean? Eventually, what they want is one set of inspectors for the entire agency that are able to inspect coal or metal, non-metal mines. They have been moving some inspectors between these divisions. As of October 1st, 2018, they flagged about 90 mines around the country where they started putting in the other mine types inspectors. So metal, non-metal mines, receiving coal inspectors. This is primarily the way that this has gone. We don't hear a lot about it, although they have flagged some metal, non-metal inspectors to go into coal mines, but for the most part, what's getting the attention is coal inspectors going into metal, non-metal mines. These inspectors should have received some specific training on the parts of the CFR which apply to the new area of mining that they're going to go into, as well as get some on-the-job training instead of just being let loose and put into a new mining environment without any experience. So of the metal, non-metal operations that I work with and that have been part of this program, I'd say for the most part it has been going all right. The area that typically, at least for my clients, results in an issue is with ground control. At least that's what I've seen, that there is a bit of a disconnect between hard rock ground control and coal mine ground control. But nonetheless, it's going to continue. They're going to reevaluate after they get through this fiscal year, and we should probably expect next year that that number will grow from 90 mines. They are aiming to use inspectors based on their proximity to a mine as opposed to whether or not they're part of a coal mine office or a metal non-metal office. We're just going to have MSHA offices, and the inspectors will go to the mines based on their proximity to them. So it is an interesting project, one that will likely continue to receive some resistance from industry, especially if you are an operation that has had a bad experience with an inspector being on site who previously was working in either metal, non-metal, or coal, and not your division of that. So we'll see what happens moving forward, but that is one area where 2019 will be a bit of a test case for moving forward. Other items that I see coming in 2019, I mentioned previously that I think we're going to see more emphasis programs or national initiatives based on different trends in the industry, whether that is serious injuries that occur or a series of fatalities that maybe are related, as opposed to getting a new section of rules to live by standards. I think we will get a new national emphasis program, which can, similar to the rules to live by, drive additional inspections, drive specific inspections. It's a new name for a similar tool. I think that there are going to be targeted inspections for powered haulage, and I think that we should be prepared for those and expect those. They might not be called a spot inspection. They might not be called an impact inspection, but they are nonetheless going to be paying particular attention to those topics. I think that we will also see some announcement on the future of a regulation for MSHA on respirable quartz or dust. There's been significant political pressure on the agency since OSHA came out with their silica rule to move forward into some type of regulation. The Assistant Secretary continues to push back, saying that the mining industry is very different than what OSHA regulates, and that we have a rule in place. But there is also going to be studies taking place regarding silica exposure and regarding a way to reduce silica exposure. Additionally, as I mentioned before, the agency has put an increased focus on health monitoring. They are looking to increase the amount of health monitoring that takes place during their inspections. They are looking to specifically target health monitoring on respirable quartz or silica exposure, and they are data collecting on this point. So I think that 2019 might hold an announcement, whether that announcement is additional monitoring or additional research, or if it is the beginning of a regulation. Last year, Assistant Secretary Zatezalo surprised a lot of people when he would not explicitly take a silica regulation off the list for our MSHA. So is it going to be created and enacted in 2019? No, I do not think that's going to be the case, but I think we might get some guidance towards the latter half of the year about how the agency wants to look at this moving forward. We're in the last 2 years of this administration, which is very surprising to say, because it feels like just last year we were talking about getting started and getting used to them, and the same could be said for some of the aspects of our presentation today. But nonetheless, we're in the last 2 years of this administration, unless there is a re-election. And so, we're going to get a better picture this year about what they want their long-term impact to be, and we're going to see them start positioning and jockeying to push that through before the end of those 2 years. So it's going to be an interesting 2019. I think we're going to have a better view of what 2020 will look at by the end of this year, because whatever they want to push through in 2020, it's going to have to be established in 2019. Also, I think there's going to be a continuance of the impact inspection program, and I say quiet on that because MSHA used to release a monthly news release that was the results of the inspection program. And many people think that it's just been discontinued given that we don't see those anymore, and we haven't seen them since early 2017. But nonetheless, the program continues, and it is based off your inspection history. It is based off of injuries or fatalities at the mine site, and the impact inspection program is still around. And I don't think that's going anywhere. I think it's just going to be done quietly without a lot of attention, but it nonetheless is still there. I also have seen, and I hope to continue to see, what I will call a common sense approach with agent liability and discrimination investigations or whistleblower investigations and how they are handled. I felt like towards the tail end of the Joe Main term at MSHA, there was a lot of blind pursuit of agent liability, regardless about what the actual factors or defenses were there, just because they felt that a supervisor must be liable. Similarly, towards the tail end of the Obama administration, when there was a spike in whistleblower claims across all industries, MSHA was no different, and these were pursued vigorously, and they still are pursued vigorously. But in my experience, there has been a bit of a more common sense approach, I will say, or an acceptance of mitigation provided by operators regarding their side of the story. Now, I'm not to say that MSHA is not pursuing or not actively investigating both of these types, whether agent liability or discrimination. They will vigorously pursue both, but I think that there has been a bit of an increase in the willingness to have dialogue regarding them. And lastly, 2019 predictions. Despite all of our best hopes with a new administration back in 2017, MSHA is going to continue to inspect you, and they are going to continue to issue citations and orders. So, just be prepared for that. It's kind of one that we shouldn't be surprised about. Unlike OSHA, we have mandatory inspections. They're going to be on site, and when they're on site, they are going to issue citations for items that they see. Just make sure that we are continuing to do our preventative steps, as well as review each citation for areas where they might not have been issued correctly. Citation contest is still a valuable tool for the industry, not only to keep your own record clean, but to keep MSHA and its inspectors in check in terms of preventing interpretations being carried forward that might not be accurate. I tell people that all the time, but when MSHA comes out and issues a citation, we not only have to think about how it affects our mine, but we should be thinking about how does this affect the mine down the street. And I hope they're thinking the same thing about how their citation affects my mine, because if there's an inspector or a field office or a district championing a new interpretation, if the operators all just pay the citation and move forward and don't challenge it, it is going to become the norm. So we want to make sure that we review our citations to see if they are in compliance or if they actually coincide with a regulation of 30 CFR. And if we don't believe that's the case, or we believe that MSHA is maybe stretching its arm a bit beyond what is the language of that regulation or the interpretation of that regulation that has existed, we want to make sure we push back, because that is how we prevent the agency from drawing too much power or too much deference. We have to check them, and that is our duty as the industry to do when we receive citations. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Don't forget, we still have a blog. This recording will also be posted on the blog, along with a review of rules and cases that come out and other items of note. We also have the remaining items as part of the webinar series. Today was our first one. We will have 5 more this year. If there's any questions that might come up during the subsequent months or weeks, please let me know. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now in the chat function, or you can feel free to reach out to me, whether by email or phone. We can go from there. All right, it does not look like we have any questions coming in. I see one asking about when we'll be sending out the PowerPoint. That will be probably in the next couple of days. I would say to expect it early next week. You'll get an email from me. It'll include a copy of the recording as well as a PDF copy of the slides. In terms of one comment that came in, it was talking about the fatalities and those listed for 2018, and it said that one of the fatalities was considered not MSHA related. That is correct. Whenever MSHA gets a fatality that is reported, they will do an investigation of whether or not it is related to the mining industry. And they will go back and update their records to remove it from that list. We have okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. So if you want to stay on, we'll continue to have a discussion on those. But one is, what about having multiple inspectors at larger mines to speed up the inspection? Is it going to be more like this? It's concerning only on a level of parent resources. So we have to be prepared for MSHA to continue to put out multiple inspectors. This is something that I've heard has been happening, and it is part of the reallocation in some areas of coal inspectors to the non-metal industry. Having multiple inspectors is something that the agency has always done at larger operations, but continues to increase its usage of so that they can get more mines inspected in shorter time. I would prepare that this is not a trend that will end quickly. In terms of preparing for it, it's going to put a strain on management resources. That is absolutely the case. We need to prepare and train additional individuals to accompany the inspectors when they're on site. And that means being aware of what their rights are, as well as what materials should be needed and maintained during that process, whether it is going to be notes or having the proper information to contact those people who may be needed at some point internally or externally. The multiple inspector process, I believe, will continue. Again, it's going to be an effort to decrease the time spent at an individual mine by having multiple inspectors and cover ground more quickly, as you mentioned. The other question is, what have I heard about how MSHA is enforcing the new workplace exams? Any guidance on how to do them or document them? So there has not been a great deal of enforcement on the new workplace exams. For the most part, from what I've heard from MSHA, is that the majority of operators have been completing them satisfactorily. When we look at the documentation, the guidance and the rule that were put out around the time of its final release and prior to outline what MSHA expects. So we want to have, the date, the area, the name of the competent person completing the exam. We want to include the description of any adverse conditions that were not immediately corrected, or promptly corrected is the term that MSHA used, and promptly means before a miner is exposed to that potential condition. That is, we also need to update the exams with the corrective action, the date of corrective action if it is not corrected promptly. So there hasn't been a whole lot of enforcement on that. I believe around the end of 2018, or I guess it was a little before then, the Southeast District had commented that they had one citation issued under the new workplace exam for violation since it had become final. So not a great deal of enforcement right now or guidance. There hasn't been any guidance put out beyond what was distributed by MSHA prior to the release or finalization of the rule. Another question is asking, why does it seem that the frac sand industry is more susceptible to inspections? I'm I'm not sure they're more susceptible to inspections. You are still going to get your inspections, but I will say that MSHA has taken notice on frac sand mines that they are probably their test case and best place to monitor health sampling. And that is because of the presence of fine-grained silica particles and respirable quartz. So yes, there has been maybe more time spent at these facilities because of the health monitoring in that aspect, but for the most part, they do get the same amount of regular safety and health inspections. You're probably seeing, though, a little more attention given on the health side, and that monitoring can be done during a regular safety and health inspection, or what some districts have been doing is sending out separate health specialists to conduct sampling at a different time. And that might, that is another inspection of sorts, and that might be what you're feeling is an increased inspection rate. But it is likely tied to the health sampling initiative that MSHA is pushing. All right, that seems like the rest of the questions at this point in time. If anyone else has any questions, I welcome you to ask them, or if you'd rather continue the conversation, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope you can join me for our next webinar in April. Thank you.